Good morning, everyone. I'm Oliver Waddington. I'm a lead BP scientist here at the MHRA. And so today I'll be talking about understanding BP monograph requirements, but with a particular focus on the requirements that sit outside the product monograph. So I'll be looking at general notices, the general monographs, the appendices and supplementary chapters. So these are some of the areas that we find are quite often missed due to the size and the complexity of the BP. So anyone who's worked with the BP will know it's not just one document or one volume. There's multiple volumes, and it contains a huge amount of information. So particularly if you've ever handled a printed copy, then you know how heavy that thing is. So that'll give you an understanding of the volume of information that is in the BP. So part of today's session, we'll be picking out some of those key sections for compliance and some of the areas that we find quite often overlooked by our users. So next slide, please, Carl. So by the end of the session, hopefully you should be able to interpret BP monographs beyond the product text. You'll be able to find where some of the key pharmacopoeia requirements sit. You'll be able to understand how the general notices, the appendices, and the supplementary chapters are applied in practice. And I'll be also going through some answers to some common questions that we receive. Next slide, please. So to start with the big picture, if you look at the BP, the full BP compliance framework, and you think of it as a set of layers, then at the top you've got your general notices. And so these are the mandatory overarching rules that govern the entire pharmacopoeia. And so they're really critical for compliance with the BP. And then below that, you've got your general monographs. So these are your formulated preparations. This will include things like your tablets, capsules, oral liquids, and so on. And then below that, you've got your product or your drug substance monographs. So this is probably where you spend most of the time within the BP. So this will include finished products, API and excipient monographs. And then you've also got appendices. So this is where a lot of the technical detail actually sits within the BP. So it includes things like methods, system suitability requirements. And then additionally, you've also got supplementary chapters. And so I've drawn this red line just to sort of separate these from the others because these are non-mandatory, but they do provide lots of really useful supporting guidance and definitely should not be neglected. And so hopefully the key message that you can take away from this is that the product monograph is only one part of the compliance framework. Next slide, please, Carl. So before going any further, I just want to highlight the how to use the BP guide. So this has recently had an update and it's much more interactive and a lot easier to use. So if you're ever unsure how to interpret a particular section, or maybe you're quite new to the BP, then it's a really useful reference point. And yeah, I highly recommend checking it out. Next slide, please. So general notices. So these contain the rules for how the BP should be applied, and understanding them is essential for compliance with the BP. Next slide, Carl. But I just want to emphasize the distinction between the BP monographs and European Pharmacopoeia monographs. So you might know already, but in the BP, we reproduce the European Pharmacopoeia monographs as part of our publication. And you can identify European Pharmacopoeia monograph by a couple of ways, but if you look in the top right, there's normally the chaplet of stars, so that'll be next to your favorites button. But you can also tell by underneath the general notices or underneath the action and use statement, it will mention European Pharmacopoeia. And so this is important because general notices part 2 applies to the BP text, whereas general notices part 3 applies to the European Pharmacopoeia text. So before applying any monograph, you should first check which type it is, as this will determine what rules apply. Next slide, please. So general notices part 2 serves several key functions. So firstly, it establishes the mandatory requirements for demonstrating compliance with BP standards. It explains how monographs, appendices, and notices all work together. So a bit like I'm doing in this presentation, but if you're ever unsure afterwards, then General Notices Part 2 summarizes this really well. Uh, Consistent interpretation. So it also defines the terminology and standardizes interpretation. Um, so, for example, it will set out things such as default temperature conditions, which is 15 to 25 degrees, unless otherwise stated within the individual monograph. Um, but there's a few things like that which you might not know if you haven't read the general notices part two. So it contains lots of key information with that regard. And then importantly, it also allows for flexibility. And so that's something that I'll expand on in the next slide. So a common question we get is, can I use an alternative method to the BP method? And so the answer to this is yes, but with certain conditions. So the general notices state analysts is not precluded from employing alternative methods, including methods of microanalysis in any assay or test if it is known that the method used will give a result of equivalent accuracy. So what does this mean in practice? Yes, you can use alternative methods. Also mentions that you can use local reference materials. However, very importantly, you must demonstrate equivalent accuracy to the BP method. And so this will involve demonstrating comparable specificity, precision, sensitivity, all the qualities that are, or the validation qualities that are outlined within ICH Q2 R2. And also importantly, this should be agreed with your relevant competent authority. So thinking of a real world example where this might apply, uh, a BP monograph might specify, say, a HPLC method for an assay or rel subs test, but maybe your lab has developed a UPLC method, which say has a quicker runtime or saves you solvent, then yes, that method is acceptable for use, provided you demonstrate equivalence to the BP method. And then critically, in any dispute, the BP method is the one that remains the authoritative method. Next slide, please, Carl. So then we have our general monographs, our formulated preparations. And so these apply to entire dosage form classes. So these include things such as your tablets, your parenteral preparations, oral liquids. It also includes general monograph for unlicensed medicines, pharmaceutical preparations, or substances for pharmaceutical use, which don't necessarily fit into that dosage form class. But these general monographs define the baseline quality requirements for things like production, performance, and they set testing expectations. So how they fit into the BP framework? Well, general monographs must be applied in addition to the product monograph. So they include requirements that are not always repeated. So if product monographs were to repeat these conditions, then they would just be incredibly long and would just not be user-friendly at all. So instead, these are all included in the general monographs, which are then referenced within the product monographs. But it's important to note that these are still mandatory for compliance. So for example, the tablets general monograph includes requirements for uniformity of content, disintegration testing. So say if, for example, you're working on your paracetamol tablets, then you must consult the tablets general monograph as well as that individual monograph. It's also worth highlighting that the BP does contain some sometimes additional requirements. So it has these extra general monographs. So where you've got the tablets general monograph, you also have tablets of the British Pharmacopoeia. And so sometimes this includes some additional BP specific requirements, or quite often they're more sort of clarification or tweaks rather than adding additional tests. But it's still very important to check both monographs before conducting any work. Next slide, please. So then we have the appendices. And so this is where significant amount of the technical detail sits within the BP. So there's 25 appendices for human medicines and another 3 for veterinary use. And together they include hundreds of individual sections and test procedures. And so the role of the appendices is they provide things like some of the analytical methods for chromatography, dissolution, sterility, for example. They also list system suitability requirements, as well as some general laboratory practices and conditions. And so monographs often reference appendices rather than repeating this information. So a bit like I just mentioned with the general monographs, if we were to repeat everything in the appendices, they would just be incredibly long and just not usable. So instead, they are referenced within the individual monographs. But a single appendix may support hundreds of different monographs. Next slide, please. And so this is one of the appendices I really want to sort of highlight, and that's Appendix 3, chromatographic separation techniques. And so it applies to all the chromatographic methods referenced in monographs, and it includes system suitability requirements, definitions and how to measure certain parameters such as signal to noise ratio or peak to valley ratio. And it also includes information on acceptable adjustments that you can make to the chromatographic conditions. And so some of the common questions that we get are, say, things like, is there a peak symmetry requirement in this monograph? Can I use a different column? Or we get better chromatography with a different mobile phase composition. Is this still compliant with the BP? And actually, all the answers to these questions can be found within Appendix 3, chromatographic separation techniques. Next slide, please. And so I have got the answers here. I won't leave you wondering what they are. Peak symmetry, yes, there is a peak symmetry requirement. So there's a requirement of 0.8 to 1.8, unless otherwise stated within the individual monograph. With regards to changing column, you can change column, but within defined limits. So for example, you can't just change the stationary phase from C18 to a C8 column, as that would fundamentally change the method. But you can change the column dimensions, but within the limits detailed within that section. And then similarly with mobile phase composition, that can be altered, but within controlled ranges. But it's worth emphasizing that if changes go beyond these limits, then revalidation is required. So I guess the key takeaway is if you're troubleshooting or changing a method, Appendix 3 is often where the answer sits in terms of what's acceptable to remain compliant with the BP. Next slide, please. So that finally brings us on to our supplementary chapters. And these are a series of 10 chapters that provide additional scientific guidance and background information for understanding some of the requirements within the Pharmacopoeia. They cover a wide range of topics such as impurities, dissolution, method validation, for example. And so they provide scientific rationale and explain the principles behind many of these BP requirements. They also aid in interpretation support and performing some of the calculations, as well as sharing some best practice guidance. So they often help you understand why methods are designed in a certain way, not just how to perform them. But it's important to point out that these supplementary chapters are non-mandatory, so they do not introduce additional requirements, but they still provide lots of really useful information. So if you're trying to think the difference between the supplementary chapters and the appendices will include the mandatory methods that you must follow. Supplementary chapters often provide the guidance and the context behind those methods. And so I've just listed a few useful chapters that I find I return to quite often. And so you've got control of impurities. This provides some really useful context behind the impurity requirements, particularly the BP's policy to record both process impurities as well as degradants. You've got pharmacopoeial calculations. So I find this is really useful for understanding the difference between quantitative limits and peak comparison limits when it comes to impurities. Pharmacopoeia organization. This has lots of information on method validation and some of the work that goes behind our monograph development. And then finally, unlicensed medicines. So if this applies to any of the products that you work on, then I definitely recommend checking out this series of supplementary chapters. Next slide, please. So finally, just to summarize, BP compliance is layered. The product monograph or the drug substance monograph is not sufficient on its own. You must also consider the general notices, the general monographs, as well as the appendices. And while not mandatory, the supplementary chapters do provide lots of really good supporting understanding and guidance. So as a final message, if you focus only on the product monographs, then you are likely missing some critical requirements. And next slide. So yeah, thank you very much for listening. Please post any questions within the Q&A, and I will hand over to Michael Whaley for the next talk.
Thank you very much. Hello, good morning. My name is Michael Whaley. I manage one of the teams here at the BP. Thank you everybody for joining today. I'm going to present about the British Pharmacopoeia 2027 edition, why it matters and what's new. So Carl, next slide, please. So these are the topics we'll be going through today. We'll start by looking at some key dates for the 2027 edition and look at the legal basis for the British Pharmacopoeia. Then I'll look back over the previous year and talk through some of the numbers that have supported the BP 2027. After that, we'll go through the new monographs included in 2027. I'll also highlight some of the revised materials in this year's edition. Next, we'll look at some of the new supporting content, including new guidance documents. And then finally, we'll have a look at some of the new online features that we hope will make the BP Online even easier to use. Next slide, please. So back in March this year, in accordance with the Human Medicines Regulations 2012, the British Pharmacopoeia Commission endorsed the publication of the 2027 edition and the British Approved Names 2027. The BP provides only official standards for pharmaceutical substances and medicinal products in the UK, and importantly, the BP sits within the Medicines and Healthcare Products Regulatory Agency. This means that we benefit from having MHRA assessors as experts on each of the BP's expert advisory groups. So users of the BP can have confidence that BP standards are developed in a way that is closely aligned with the expectations of the wider regulatory framework for medicines in the UK. The BP 2027 edition will be published on the 1st of August. It'll be available digitally and will also be available in print. All formats contain both European Pharmacopoeia and British Pharmacopoeia material, including the BP's extensive selection of formulated preparations, which is made up of over 1,500 drug product monographs. The digital edition includes the European Pharmacopoeia material up to issue 13.1. And another benefit of the digital products is that they also receive in-year updates. So for BP 2027, those updates will cover European Pharmacopoeia issues 13.2, 13.3, and 14.1. The BP 2027 will become effective on the 1st of January 2027. Next slide, please. So looking back at the previous year since the last annual webinar, I've pulled out a few key numbers that help show the scale of the work behind the BP 2027. The headline figures are that for the BP 2027, we have 18 new monographs, 132 updated texts, and 33 new British approved names. And sitting behind those headline numbers are some wider figures that may be of interest. We had over 100,000 active users of the BP Online over the previous year, and we had 59 draft text consultations completed. Those draft texts are published on our website quarterly, so users can review and comment on proposed changes before they are finalised. All of this work is supported by our network of BP experts. At the last count, we had 219 experts giving their time to help us develop new texts, revise existing monographs, and make sure the standards remain useful and relevant. We had 11 observers at the June 2026 BP Commission meeting who took part in a pilot project to allow observers into a Commission meeting for the first time. So if you're interested in observing a BP Commission meeting in the future, please do look out for upcoming opportunities. And finally, we answered 1,540 queries over the past calendar year, helping users understand more about the BP and how BP standards are applied in practice. Next slide, please. There are 18 new BP monographs in the 2027 human and vet editions, and they're listed here. Firstly, we have brimonidine eye drops, which are used in the treatment of ocular hypertension. We also have developed a new monograph for carvedilol oral suspension, which has been developed to cover unlicensed formulations. There's a new monograph for co-caroldopa prolonged release tablets, which is widely prescribed in the UK and used to improve the signs of Parkinson's disease. We have a new monograph for copper sulfate sterile concentrate, and 3 new monographs for fludarabine products. These medicines are used in the treatment of chronic lymphocytic leukemia and appear on various critical medicines lists, including the WHO Essential Medicines list. We have a new monograph for glycoside oral suspension and 3 new monographs for melatonin products. That's melatonin oral solution, one for the prolonged release tablets and one for the tablets product. These are used in certain circumstances for the treatment of insomnia and have been developed in response to high levels of UK prescribing. We've got 2 new monographs for ropinirole products, one for the prolonged release tablets and one for tablets. And there's a new monograph for topiramate tablets, as well as a new monograph for juniper tincture, which has been added to our selection of herbal and complementary medicine monographs. And finally, in our veterinary companion volume, we've got 3 new monographs for marbofloxacin products. Some of you may already be aware of some of these new monographs because you might have seen them during our consultation windows, and you may even have submitted questions or comments on those draft texts. So if you did, thank you very much. That input's really important and helps us make sure that the monographs we publish are a suitable public quality standard for medicines in the UK and contain suitable analytical methods for the people who need to apply them. Next slide, please. Looking at the revised monographs in the BP 2027, we've got over 100 revised monographs, including technical revisions to a number of important formulated preparations. It's not practical to list them all here, but for example, the monograph for warfarin tablets has been revised to include changes to the related substances test. We've also revised monographs for timolol tablets and a number of our clarithromycin products monographs. There are also revisions to the indapamide products, including indapamide tablets and indapamide prolonged release tablets. And these revisions include new or revised identification tests, updated rel subs methods, and updates to uniformity of content and assay procedures. So my overall message here on this slide is that a lot of these monographs include technical changes that improve the BP monographs, and users should review these revised texts carefully before the BP 2027 becomes effective. Next slide, please. We also have new BPCRS for BP 2027. We've got 13 brand new British Pharmacopoeia chemical reference substances that are being established this year to support the new edition. And also there are 2 changes to the use of existing BPCRS. Some of these BPCRS are available already, and we would expect all the new BPCRS to be available to purchase through the catalogue by the publication date. And just as a reminder, if you're using the BP online, you can access details of the relevant BPCRS directly from the monograph using the tabs above the monograph title. Next slide, please. So touched on it before, but we've also got a new British approved names publication for 2027. This digital-only publication is fully cross-linked to the British Pharmacopoeia for purchases and subscribers, and will be available from the 1st of August alongside the Pharmacopoeia. There are 33 new entries in this edition, and this year includes a number of new British approved names for veterinary drugs. The ban ensures standardization and clarity in drug nomenclature and is produced each year by our BP experts, whose experience spans international nomenclature policy, WHO naming programs, clinical pharmacology, pharmaceutical standards, and leading academic institutions. Next slide, please. We also have new guidance available this year. So many of you hopefully will be already familiar with the interactive How to Use the BP guide, which was launched in the final quarter of 2025. And this is a really helpful guide for navigating your way around the monograph and understanding how to interpret a monograph and how the different sections fit together. And since the last annual webinar, we've also published 1 new and 1 revised non-mandatory guidance document for the advanced therapy medicinal products, or ATMPs. The guidance on the determination of genomic titer and vector copy number for RAAV and LVRV products has been updated, so it's great to have a revision to that. And we've also introduced new guidance on replication competent virus testing. The BP ATMP guidance has been developed as an advisory resource, offering expert recommendations, examples, and points for consideration, rather than setting mandatory requirements. However, we know from our feedback that this guidance is really useful to organizations developing or testing these products. And the documents are free to download from the BP website, and they're also available as part of your BP online subscription. Next slide, please. So a really interesting new feature that we're launching with the BP Online for BP 2027, and one that a lot of users have been asking us for, is an improved way to see which texts are new and which have been updated and which have been omitted. So the advanced search feature now includes a status option. So from BP 2027 onwards, you can select new, updated, or omitted and filter the content to see exactly what has changed in the edition. That means, for example, if you want to know what's new in the BP 2027, which texts have been updated, you can now search for that directly rather than refer to the list in the introduction. This feature won't be available for the BP 2026 or earlier, but from the BP 2027 onwards, it'll be built into BP Online, and we really hope it'll be of real practical value to you. And on the next slide, we have a bit of a worked example. So here it is. It's a worked example to show how the new status filter can be used alongside other BP Online features. So I've taken the example here of co-carol-dopa tablets in the BP 2027, which is being updated. You can see that it's flagged in the search results with a new yellow updated tag in that top left image. And then if you click through to that monograph page and look at the revision history, you can see a short summary of the technical changes made for BP 2027. So in this example, we can see that there's been a technical change to the production statement and to the content limits. A new ID test has been added, the solution has been updated, the rel subs test has been added, and the assay has been updated, as well as an impurity statement. And then if you combine that with the track changes feature on the right-hand side of this slide, you can see exactly what's changed in the monograph, using color and strike through to show the changes clearly. So in this example, for instance, you can see that the content limit has changed, as well as other changes. So taken together, we think the status filter, revision history, and track changes feature give users a much clearer route through the updated edition. And we hope this is a really positive step forward for the BP Online, and it helps users track what's new and what's changed, makes your navigation of compliance just that little bit smoother. Next slide, please. Yep, and that brings me to the end of my presentation. Thank you very much for your time today, and I hope that has given you a useful overview of what's new in the BP 2027. And I will pass you over to Sam for the next presentation.
Good morning. Thank you very much, Michael, for that introduction as well. It's lovely to be here and a privilege to kind of speak to you all today as well. And I'd also like to just briefly extend my thanks to the BP and TSO teams for the opportunity to speak here this morning as well. So today I'd like to cover a few areas, broadly discussing the Pharmacopoeia as a component of the pharmaceutical quality system, what that means to an inspector, and the risk associated with its management and how non-compliance can potentially manifest. Next slide, please. So just a brief introduction to, I suppose, the MHRA and the inspector's place within it. So the MHRA operates within the UK statutory framework, supporting innovation and working with industry to bring new drugs safely to patients. But our work also involves regulating the industry, which is supported by the work of the inspectors across all GXPs, performing inspections, assessing license variations, etc. And my place within all of this is within the GMP inspectors group within Compliance Team 2. So we have a broad focus on GMP, but we also review GDP where there's significant overlap and frequently work with inspectors in other GXPs as well. And just a little bit about myself, I joined the agency as an inspector in May 25, but prior to that, I have approximately 10 years in sterile pharmaceutical manufacture as well. Next slide. So just an overview of the topics I'd like to cover. This will be quite a high-level review, but it will ideally provide some context to the expectations regarding GMP compliance as it pertains to the BP, and how an inspection may seek to verify this. I'll also speak a little on the subject of how inspectors use the BP and expectations for compliance with the Pharmacopoeia. And in addition, I'll also summarize a few risks we kind of commonly identify, as well as how those can be managed as well. Next slide, please. So when we consider the inspection process and its basis within the UK's regulatory framework, it's good to have an understanding of where the BP really fits in. So part 2 of the Human Medicines Regulations requires the British Pharmacopoeia Commission to prepare and publish new editions of the BP as the UK standard for medical products. So here we have really the legal mandate for its publication and its use to support GMP operations throughout the UK. Additionally, the HMRs explicitly require pharmacopoeia compliance of a product throughout its life cycle as well. Pharmacopoeia compliance is also specifically called out through the guidance where it supports specific processes. So, for example, Annex 1 references the pharmacopoeia when outlining testing for WFI and water systems. Chapter 6, of course, discusses reference standards as well. So here we can see that compliance with the BP really is a regulatory expectation for organizations operating in accordance with GMP, specifically where it's relevant to their activities. It bears mentioning as well, the BP also shares context with the European Pharmacopoeia, which can be seen either where that chaplet of stars is printed next to the title in the printed version, or as indicated here within the web version of a monograph. This identifies the aligned expectations across kind of various regulatory environments as well. Next slide, please. So, how do inspectors use the BP during an inspection? The approach to the BP is the same area as really any other area of inspection, and that really begins with the question, show me your compliance. The BP allows an inspector to verify organizational compliance in a number of areas throughout the PQS, or pharmaceutical quality system. A good place to start with this is with the general monographs, which can describe quite broadly the pharmacopoeia requirements for a given product type. For example, specials labeling requirements come up quite frequently on inspection as a standard against which processes would be directly assessed, particularly where we're looking at an organization which holds an MS or specials license. And general monographs for dosage forms such as capsules provide really clear guidance for their testing and production. And these can often help form the basis for an inspector's assessment of process control within a facility, as well as product control as well, for example, microbial limit testing on other key properties. So in this, we can see that the BP can really help structure some of our questions during an inspection. While we may not in conversation be referencing the BP directly, it certainly helps and provides a bit of a scaffold for how we would go and inspect a given dosage form or a given process. So to that end, we may also review individual test methods. We would typically do this where they pertain to a particular focus within the inspection. So for example, they can be used to assess test methods typical for a dosage form. A good example again is endo and sterility testing for sterile products, but we can also interrogate general reagents such as WFI and acetone, which are used to support compendial methods. And the monograph for WFI, again, for example, can be used to assess pure steam generation. So a good question to ask here is, what does this mean in practical terms for an organization? Well, during an inspection, an inspector is more likely to ask for evidence of alignment to the BP rather than inspect directly against it. So the consideration here is really to be ready to demonstrate that traceability to the pharmacopoeia, and where methods do depart from the monograph, really do be able to justify this on a sound scientific basis with a really robust risk assessment. This is really crucial, and we'll see why in a moment. So, having established the regulatory need for compliance with the BP and, broadly speaking, the inspector's approach during an inspection, can a deficiency be structured with reference to the BP? Next slide, please. Well, broadly speaking, yes. It's most common for the initial GMP reference to be based in the guidance, and the exact method or monograph in the BP referenced as kind of supporting information to clarify the context of that deficiency. We have 3 examples here. The first 2 assess individual test methods and their compliance to the BP, specifically where the individual test methods were reviewed and found to be deficient against the pharmacopoeia requirements. The last deficiency, I think, is of particular interest. So this deficiency formed part of a critical deficiency which was issued to a site for micro-testing of non-sterile products. It bears mentioning that where we raise a critical deficiency, it will usually have a headline which describes in broad terms the scope. And under this headline, particularly fell a number of failures to interpret and apply the Pharmacopoeia method consistently. For example, different methods for inducing product disintegration, various steps in sample preparation were used for the same test on different occasions. And in this case, this was testing supporting product release. A lack of compliance with the compendial method here, and in many other cases, can present a real patient risk. So these examples, I think, really demonstrate that it's not sufficient just to remain up to date with the Pharmacopoeia, though that is a large amount of what I'll discuss shortly. Compliance with the Pharmacopoeia really must be ingrained within your PQS, its processes and the people undertaking those activities as well. The BP doesn't just sit on a shelf awaiting reference. It really needs to live within your pharmaceutical quality system. So having explored a little about how inspectors use the BP and its application in the context of an inspection, I think we have another couple of useful questions. What are the inspector's expectations? And how can an organization ensure and maintain compliance? Next slide, please. So when an inspector is on site, what are they actually looking for? What I'll outline here is quite fundamental, but it really is very important. The BP must be kept up to date, and this must also be reflected in current processes where the practices and requirements in those processes are outlined by the most recent version of the British Pharmacopoeia. The BP must be really fully adopted by the PQS. This includes practices such as version control, ensuring old versions, particularly in case the print copy, are archived and no longer available for routine use, as well as ensuring appropriate levels of access within the organization as well. So the Pharmacopoeia must remain easily accessible. Easy access to the BP discourages practices such as the use of saved PDFs of monographs, uncontrolled printouts, for example, as well. These are very rarely managed as controlled documents within the PQS or reconciled upon the publication of a new edition. This kind of activity, where it's identified as well, often indicates poor documentation practices throughout the PQS. Thirdly, alternative methods, and I think Ollie spoke to this a little earlier in his presentation. Alternative methods can be used, but they really, really must be justified. I think a good example for this would be something like an API or an active pharmaceutical ingredient for an investigatory medical product may not have its own Pharmacopoeia reference standard, or there may be a novel dissolution test in use for a particularly unusual formulation. Both approaches are fine, but either way, the risk really must be thoroughly assessed, really thoroughly understood, and very, very well justified. And just lastly here, the manufacturing authorization holder as well is also required to ensure that material and product specifications in the MA include tests according to the current Pharmacopoeia. Next slide, please. So we've spoken a little bit about maintaining the Pharmacopoeia within the pharmaceutical quality management system. The best approach for this really is quite simple and utilizes a process your PQS should already have. And that is really to treat it like any other controlled document within your PQS, or at the very least in accordance with those principles. When we think of the Pharmacopoeia under GMP conditions, version control and compliance are really imperative to ensure its effectiveness as a supporting pillar of your GMP compliance. So new updates are highly publicized well ahead of their implementation date. New versions are published in August for their release the following year, and digital updates are released 3 times in year with the latest European Pharmacopoeia issues as well. So do subscribe to those email updates. That's going to ensure that you're aware of these updates. It means you can also ahead of time perform a gap analysis against your current processes, any monographs, methods, or appendices that you may use included in that, and ensure this reviews updates to dependencies as well. And I'll speak a little about that in a moment too. This is also relevant to equipment manufacturers to ensure that their products support the updated methods when necessary, whether that's a hardware or a software update as well. And if you're using the digital-only version, ensure that you do reference the portal every time. You really can't rely on downloaded PDFs of monographs. Again, this is something we occasionally see, and it really does present a real compliance risk. They may drift out of date and are frequently not managed as controlled documents. Such practices should also be a focus of the self-inspection process as well. Lastly, just on the digital version, ensuring everyone has their own login for every system really ensures you're not encouraging bad IT and data integrity practices throughout your organization as well. So really do just ensure access is available to all personnel who routinely reference the BP to support their activity and GMP processes. And that's really just ensuring you're making compliance the course of least resistance in that regard. Next slide, please. So some common risks we often identify. First of all, a narrow review of an individual monograph following an update can cause your processes and methods to drift out of compliance, particularly if your review only focuses on a specific monograph. So a good example for this is the general monograph for ramipril, which references dissolution, liquid chromatography, and a host of various other general reagents. If you see, or if you are assessing your processes against just the top level of ramipril capsule monograph and don't pay attention to the included dependencies, you may find that some areas of your PQS, such as reagent prep, may drift out of date. Poor version control can also manifest similarly, but is also indicative of a PQS with a potentially heightened degree of risk regarding documentation management. Really, this is also about ensuring just easy access for all of those whose work depends upon it. And lastly, where we depart from the compendial method, it's important to understand whether this is necessary or appropriate in the first place. And if it is, just ensure that the approach taken has been sufficiently risk assessed. So what are our key takeaways for this? First of all, an inspector's focus is usually show me. So being able to demonstrate currency with or traceability to the BP really supports your demonstration of organizational compliance. But that's not just during the inspection. That supports your day-to-day operations as well. We're not compliant just on the day of inspection. Second of all, ensure the BP is treated as any other controlled document within the PQS with effective archiving or obsolescence practices, particularly for the print version. And controlled copies where your PQS allows them as well. It's also important to ensure the PQS is sensitive to the BP's update cycle. So place a reminder in there or ensure that there are regular checks, particularly for those in-year updates as well for the digital version too. Easy accessibility really is key to ensure compliance with the most recent version. And lastly, do just ensure that departure from the BP is well risk managed where it does occur. So I hope that's given a little bit of insight into the inspector's perspective of the BP, how we use it, what our expectations for the BP are, where we're verifying GMP compliance as well, and a little bit about the risks that we commonly see occurring on GMP sites. So with that, I'll thank you very much for your kind attention, and I'll hand back to Carl.